السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. نخب فكرية عالمية اجتمعت في روسيا لتوصيف شكل تحالفات الغد وملامحها وإلى أين، ولا سيما في ظل التطورات المتسارعة والخطرة في المنطقة والعالم. المؤتمر السنوي الثالث عشر لنادي فالداي للمناقشة وتبادل الآراء والخبرات من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. لعل نادي فالداي الروسية للمناقشة وتبادل آراء الخبراء استقى اسمه من بحيرة فالداي، حيث عقد على ضفافها الاجتماع الأول للنادي عام 2004. وكما انسيابية البحيرة يجري الحوار بين النخب الروسية والنخب العالمية للخروج بتحليلات مستقلة وغير منحازة للأحداث السياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية في الداخل الروسي وفي العالم. وتعد الإمكانات الفكرية لنادي فالداي للمناقشة غاية في الأهمية في كل من روسيا والخارج. منذ انطلاق أعمال النادي شارك أكثر من 1000 ممثل للمجتمع العلمي الدولي من أكثر من 63 دولة في لقاءاته، بمن فيهم من كبار الأكاديميين والأساتذة من كبرى الجامعات في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية كجامعات هارفارد وكولومبيا وجورج تاون وستانفورد وكارلتون وجامعة لندن والقاهرة وطهران وشرق الصين وجونز هوبكنز وطوكيو والسوربون وسواها. ويبقى الأعضاء الدوليون الدائمو العضوية العمود الفقري للنادي، ويدعى خبراء أجانب كل عام. أما أعضاء النادي الروس فيتضمنون علماء في السياسة والاقتصاد وإعلاميين وشخصيات عامة وصناع السياسة، وأيضا ممثلي السلطتين التشريعية والتنفيذية. ألستر كروك الدبلوماسي الأوروبي السابق ومدير منتدى النزاعات من المشاركين في حوارات نادي فالداي، ويخبرنا من الداخل عن أبرز العناوين التي ركزت عليها لقاءات الدورة 13 للنادي في سوتشي في أكتوبر تشرين الأول الماضي، ويحدثنا عن الانتقادات التي وجهت إلى روسيا، ويشرح بالتفصيل خطاب الرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين الذي كان علامة فارقة هذا العام بالرسائل التي تضمنها. Alistair Crook, former EU diplomat, founder and director of Conflicts Forum. Welcome to من الداخل from the inside, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're always welcome.
I'm very pleased to be here.
It's our pleasure, sir. Well, at the 13th annual discussion meeting of the Valdai Club in Sochi last October, foreign and domestic experts and politicians had an opportunity to exchange views on major international challenges and trends. Alistair, you were there, you were part of these discussions and meetings. I would appreciate if you can give us a roundup of the type of participants that were there in the meetings and what were the topics that this meeting focused on the most this year.
Well, the history of it was this discussion club was originally a core of Americans that were Russia experts. Academics, people from Harvard, from Yale, elsewhere, some of them, most of them Russian speakers, but concentrated on Russia. Now it has expanded a little and looks a bit beyond just Russia-American relations, and so this was the meeting which took place it was just last week. The focus of it was really about a world in disorder and the way ahead. And the most important contribution, everyone spoke. There was Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Vice Foreign Minister, the Vice Premier, lots of people were speaking from Russia, head of the Duma. But of course, President Putin's contribution, which was for 3 hours, more than 3 hours,
his speech
was crucial. His speech
was a landmark speech. Yeah.
It was very important because it was, you'll see if you look at the press and you look at the news, it will have focused on Ukraine and Aleppo. But actually what he did was to lay out a philosophical view of what is happening and how to deal with it. And it was, listen to the parts of it in rapt silence. It was a very powerful presentation. But the gist of it was the sense of
Alistair,
how to deal with this disorder.
Yes, we will talk in details about this speech. We will dissect the speech of President Putin. But allow me to ask you about the type of participants. You talked about the Russian side. What about the foreign experts?
The American experts, the core American experts, with perhaps one exception, were really quite antagonistic. And
what do you mean by antagonistic?
Antagonistic, critical of Russia, asked all the time whether Russia was falling apart, whether it was going to decompose, their economic problems. Some got up and described the elections as false. There are no free and fair elections. They complained about Russian interference in the election process. They asked why the middle classes were not properly represented. It was a very negative, negative attitude to it. Even one participant got up and said, you know, there are no free and fair elections. Does anyone in this room believe that there are elections that are held in this way in Russia? Put your hand up if you believe this. It was quite aggressive language towards Russia. But the most significant thing was that all of these, after all, I've just described them, these were academics, these were not officials. And these academics all spoke about we, Washington, we. And it was very clearly that we're talking about people who were wanting to put across and felt they were part of the American government's, if you like, agenda. And all of them were very rooted in an agenda which was very clear, particularly in foreign policy, that there had been a ceasefire that had been agreed. President Putin had turned his back on that ceasefire, broken the ceasefire, carpet-bombed Aleppo, attacked humanitarian convoys. Schools, hospitals were damaged. And the regular
narrative that is found in the mainstream media.
But the regular narrative. But these are people who speak Russian. These are people, are experts who've been following Russia for years. They can hear they can read what's written in Russia. They're not just dependent on the New York Times.
How do you explain their attitude, Alistair?
I think it's reflective of something much deeper that we're seeing at the moment. It was described, someone as at the meeting, one of the Russians, as a pre-war atmosphere. It was no meeting of minds. It wasn't
a meeting to dialogue and exchange ideas.
It wasn't. There were little bits of it, but mostly it was antagonistic. It was deeply oppositional. And there was no sense that the Americans came away understanding or converted, but left, I think, quite deeply entrenched in their position. So I think that this is a reflection of the time we're in, where people are, there's a big gap, and there's no discussion. And actually, Putin did refer to this during the meeting.
What about the topics that the meeting of this year focused on?
It was really
what were the main topics?
The main topics were about change and about the new era. But there were also, for the first time, the Chinese were present and senior representatives. So it was also looking at Eurasia and the Eurasian economic community and the development of that. But it was also striking on such topics about how technology not just is changing the economy, but is shifting the distribution of power in a global sense. That it's not just a simple, question of what's a new technology, but how it's shifting, if you like, the distribution of power.
Very good. Now, the theme for the meetings this year was the future in progress, shaping the world of tomorrow, as you said. So was it intended to outline today the contours of tomorrow's world?
Yes. But first of all, it was about defining the world as it is now, which they described, and President Putin
How did they
said,
define it?
in a simple term. And they said, we're entering a new order, a new global order, and that order is likely to be disorder. So it was very much focused on the disorder. And President Putin explained what this disorder was. He said, essentially, that globalization, he used the word retreat, but in a sense is stalled and reversing itself. It's coupled also with, if you like, an economic crisis that is apparent in the West, in America, and in Europe, where today there's turmoil in much of the financial markets. But beyond that, he was looking at something, again, which is very important. He was looking at the way in which he described what's happening at a popular level, that people are voting in unexpected ways. And this is shocking, if you like, the status quo.
How do you explain the change in the mood of the people? Why are we to say and to define this as people voting in an unexpected way? Why is it that unexpected?
First of all, he mentioned, President Putin said that partly it was a reflection of the fact that taking part in elections was not changing anything. That if people voted and they voted the wrong way, they were simply made to vote in a different way until they got the answer that was wanted from them. But I think that what we are seeing, and this he didn't say expressly, but what we're seeing is this is the end of globalization, in the sense globalization is now stalled and in retreat. Even the Financial Times says so, I assume it must be true. But what do we mean by that? Is that there's really no growth. All of the main engines of growth that we have seen, I mean, not over these years, really since the Second World War, are coming to an end.
We will also give some time to discuss the financial item that is tipping the balance perhaps in politics. But also last year, Alistair, the Valdai Forum participants discussed the problems with the current world order. How much has changed since then for this year?
Let me be clear, in the sense that although we were talking about a new world order coming around, and also we've seen President Xi speaking about this a few months earlier when he addressed the Chinese Communist Party. What they were talking about in the sense is, and he said, President Xi said very clearly, a new world order is coming about. There is an economic crisis, Europe is disintegrating, and there will be a new order in the next years. It's not that China and Russia are seeking to impose a new order. I don't believe they think they have the power to do that anyway. But what they're saying is actually the crisis that we're seeing in terms of the change in popular sentiment of, Brexit, the consequences of the elections in America, are in themselves the mother and father of a change that's taking place in terms of the New World Order. But Putin was quite clear what sort of order he's looking towards. And I think it's probably a view shared by China. But it's going to be not the unipolar order of the world today. It's going to be a much more multipolar order, and one based on international law.
Right, Alistair, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then after the break we're going to dissect the speech of Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Valdai Club. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. كروك الدبلوماسي الأوروبي السابق ومدير منتدى النزاعات، كيف يقرأ خطاب الرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين في نادي فالداي في أكتوبر تشرين الأول المنصرم، وما كانت النقاط الرئيسية التي ركز عليها، وما الرسائل التي كان مرادا إيصالها للعالم، وكيف يصف نبرة بوتين في خطابه.
Yes, I think it's really important to underline this, that when he was talking about disorder, it was not something that Russia was attempting to create or to try and impose a new order, but he was simply saying, these are the facts. We are, for all sorts of reasons, we're moving to an order of disorder. Mm-hmm. It's uncomfortable, and he was suggesting, too, that we need to deal with this and to manage this disorder. And he was saying, in a sense, the unipolar world, it's not just that Russia doesn't like it, it is just not working. Mm-hmm. The exceptionalism of America and the insistence on its leadership, but more importantly, and he underlined, it's not just exceptionalism, but it's sort of exceptionalism plus, mm-hmm. in the sense that there is no discussion. And now America,
there is no way for discussion.
There's no way for discussion. And he described very clearly, he said, in 94, when America unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, mm-hmm. for no apparent reason, but they just decided to withdraw from it. At that time, he'd said to them, okay, so what do we discuss next? What should we, where do you see this going? And they said, no, we're not discussing this. We don't intend to talk about this at all. And he said, well, we Russia have to make our own plans, take measures for this. And they said, do what you like. Go off and do what you like. And he says, even now, they refuse to discuss the tensions that are rising. So he was saying that this is the danger. This is actually part of the cause of the disorder in the world. Not simply that Russia just doesn't like it and wants to have more say, but this is a disorder that is a very powerful disorder, and then he outlined the 2 steps to deal with it.
Right.
And they're quite simple steps.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about his tone, Alistair?
His tone, again, very important to say, throughout this presentation, there was one theme that kept coming back, not only from him, which he repeated several times, but from all of them. The Russians remained extremely polite, extremely courteous, and kept saying, the door is open
for cooperation, for dialogue.
Whether it's on the missile crisis, whether it's on Ukraine, whether it's on Syria, all these things, they said, the door remains open. Mm-hmm. And, this was done at a time when Russia is being heavily criticized about what is happening in Syria and in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And all the time, the door to dialogue, the door to discussion and cooperation remains open.
Right. On this, analysts believe that the Valdai event was held against the background of a deep crisis in international relations shortly after the failure of negotiations over the war in Syria and the lack of significant progress on the Ukrainian problem. Russia is committed to dialogue, as you said, but will never make concessions without reciprocity. Was this message clearly delivered by Putin?
I think that's a very inaccurate description of it, mm-hmm. because it's quite clear, and Putin made it plain also, that actually there was reciprocity throughout this, that Russia was making concessions. We're talking here about Syria now. The 2 ceasefires, one in February and then again in September. And he
reciprocity from the West.
There was no reciprocity. The West promised some reciprocity, but was unable to deliver it, or refused to deliver it in the case of Syria. But he pointed out very clearly that Russia had made concessions. For example, they had agreed in the second ceasefire that there would be no flying during the period of the ceasefire by the Syrian Air Force or the Russian Air Force. And previously that had not been against any target at all. There would be a complete, if you like, stoppage of flights during this. And that was, he said, a big concession because, of course, ISIS and Nusra never felt committed to this ceasefire. So he described that. But he said very clearly, and I think that was apparent during the whole tenor of the discussions, that either the Americans did not want or were unable to comply with the say-so.
Right. Now, throughout his speech, Putin expressed, quote, Russia's desire to get out of the vicious circle of mutual accusations with the West and with the United States in particular. At the opening of his speech, he said, I'm not retired yet, because when the moderator, he just presented him, and he talked about retirement issues. So he said, I'm not retired yet, and I'm for now the leader of this big country. As such, it is fitting to show restraint and avoid displays of excessive aggressiveness. Also, quote, we do not see global domination, expansion, or confrontation with anyone. What about what's taking place in Syria?
I mean, what you said is absolutely right. First of all, the thing about retirement was just a jocular point.
Yeah,
it wasn't very serious.
Yes.
And it didn't indicate anything about Putin's intentions for the next election. But what the tenor of what you said is absolutely right. It's not Russia is not trying to become a new global power in that sense. One questioner said, what happens if Iraq or Libya ask for your support against terrorism in their country? He answered very simply. He said, we are not thinking about that at all. In other words, they're not planning to take over the Middle East and to restart the empire at all. Their involvement in Syria has been low-key. It's involved a small number of aircraft, principally throughout this time. The expense of it has almost been entirely borne on the Russian Defense Department training budget. So they are not trying to become a global hegemon to compete with the United States. They are going to work in cooperation with China. And that comes really back to the vision he has for the future of the global order. And he said there are two steps to the future. The first step, which is the simple one, apparently, but actually quite difficult, is let's start actually observing international law, which Western states have stopped doing for some time, and the UN Charter. At least it may not be international law as it stands, may not be perfect, but we have it. Let's do that.
Let's abide by it.
Let's abide by it. Let's start with that. The next stage, then, he said very clearly, is first of all, let's amend the international law by consensus in a way that reflects the particular circumstances of individual states. They're all different. And also reflects the fact that they have different national aspirations. It's not one size fits all for all these states, and importantly respects
there is
sovereignty.
The cultural difference and peculiarities.
And yes, they don't have to have the same form of government, the same democracy.
Sure.
So let's have that. First of all, agree international law that respects the particular circumstances, the individuality, and also the sovereignty of the states. And we'll do that with all the states, bring them all into to this process. It's got to be not just, he was very clear, it can't be just the five powers who were the victors at the end of the Second World War. It has to have the support globally for these changes. So that was his description of where the global order had to go. But, very clearly, there is a sense from this, and he talked about a gloomy atmosphere generally, but he talked really about this populism, and that there is a big shift taking place within ordinary people at all levels.
Right. Mr. Krook, allow us to stop now because time has run short, and we're going to meet next week to talk in a second part of this interview about the different focal points in the speech of President Vladimir Putin, to dissect it even more. Mr. Alistair Krook, former EU diplomat and founder and director of Conflicts Forum, many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on your program.
You're always welcome, sir. إذا اللقاء يتجدد في الأسبوع المقبل في هذا الحوار بجزئه الثاني للحديث أكثر عن مفاصل رئيسية في خطاب الرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين خلال حديثه لنادي فالداي للمناقشة وتبادل الآراء والخبرات من كل فريق فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.